Looking to buy, sell, or grow your business to position it for a sale? As the owner and managing partner of Sun Acquisitions, Domenic Rinaldi has personally been involved in over 300 M&A transactions. He has seen and done it all, consulting with large and small businesses across a broad range of industries. On M&A Unplugged, he'll interview buyers, sellers, and their advisors about their experiences scaling, selling, and acquiring businesses. On every episode, you will get key learnings, but most importantly, you will be better prepared for your own acquisition or sale. This is M&A Unplugged with your host, Domenic Rinaldi.
M&A Unplugged community, if you have ever acquired a business and had to deal with the integration issues after the transaction closes, you understand the amount of time and the level of difficulty in this phase. There are so many ways that a deal can falter if the integration isn't properly planned. Well, today we have an expert on M&A, integration, planning, and strategy, Jeff Alvis. Jeff is a director at the Keystone Group, a middle market consulting firm, where he has helped dozens of companies assess, plan, and execute deals of various shapes and sizes in a variety of industries. This work has resulted in smooth transitions, accelerated synergy, and integrated cultures. Jeff has been published in various national publications, has served on several local boards, including his current position on the Northwestern Board of Medicine. And I'll also say, and I'm glad to say, that the Keystone Group is a sponsor of the M&A Unplugged podcast. Jeff, thank you for joining me today. I'm so glad to have you.
Oh, thank you, Domenic. I appreciate the opportunity and certainly love talking about this stuff. So ready to go.
So let's start there. If you could give the M&A Unplugged community some background on the Keystone Group and the work that you do.
Sure, I'd love to. Keystone's it's an interesting firm. It was started in 1991 by a few guys that were on the partner track at Anderson Consulting at the time. And while they were doing well there, they felt that there was a void in the market for a firm that would help middle market companies, and in a kind of a different way than many of the other sort of large consulting firms. So they decided to focus on middle market clients, companies that primarily are manufacturers, distributors, and business services. And also, one of the things that we bring to the party, which we pride ourselves on, is being very hands-on and helping people not only with upfront assessments and planning and analysis, but also being there to help them when they implement the various things that we help them do. And those things fall into a few buckets. So the firm started actually doing turnaround work where bankers would refer us into their customers whose companies weren't performing particularly well. And we would help identify the sources of profit and cash leakage, develop a plan with the management team, and then get the support of the bank to help them get out of the trouble that they're in and not get into it again. That sort of morphed into doing similar kinds of work, but for companies that were healthy. So today we still do a lot of the turnaround work, but we also do a lot of work with our clients on fairly targeted initiatives around growth strategy and around operational improvement. And there's a whole variety of different things that we do. But again, most of them are ones where we can get our arms around it. We do a quick analysis and assessment, and then we work closely with the management team to execute on those initiatives. And then finally, topic for today is M&A integration. And in those situations, we help in, I like to think of it as pre-close and post-close work. And in pre-close, we help them do various things to assess the value of the business. So we'll help oftentimes with what we think of as forward-looking due diligence. So not necessarily what has the company been and what is it, but what's it going to look like when the acquisition occurs. So we'll often help with various aspects of operational or commercial due diligence. And then we also assist with pre-close planning, and I can talk more about that later. And then, as I've kind of mentioned, post-close, we often help with key initiatives, and usually there's a few that will really move the needle, whether it's process integration or business integration and or synergy capture. And there too, we work closely with the management teams to help them accelerate the time to benefit, which is, I think, one of the most important things to do to make an acquisition successful.
Man, I'm so excited. We have some great stuff to unpack here today. There's a lot of meat on this bone. I could see a couple of podcasts. There's so much here, but let me start with on the pre-planning side. How early do clients bring you in? Like, are they bringing you in as they're drawing up their strategy for acquisitions, or are they bringing you in after they've, found a deal and are starting to go down the path of acquisition?
It's a good question. I would say it's changing a little bit. Years ago, we often would get called, or if we were talking to someone in corporate development or a COO or someone like that who we're trying to build a relationship with, they often would get us in what I think is later in the cycle, because often people didn't think about integration until after they had done due diligence and were kind of far down the pike, and then said, oh, gee, this is going to close in a month or two. Now what do I do? And we've always believed that you need to be thinking about integration from the get-go. And I heard a couple of the other podcasters talk about having, a good M&A strategy that then drives what you want to do with the businesses that you acquire, which starts as early as possible. So we don't really think about diligence and planning separately. That's why I really think of it as pre-close. So I think from the very beginning, the company should be thinking about, I obviously need to figure out what this company is all about and the value of it, but the strategy and how we're going to integrate is so important to keep diligence focused and to do the planning effectively. So I would say, Dominic, more recently, I think as people have begun to realize that that's important, we've been asked to get in and help them earlier in the cycle than previously. But, we get calls from people who have bought something and maybe it's not going so well. So in a variety of circumstances.
So that's your triage group, right?
It is. It can be, unfortunately.
Yeah, that's got to be a bad day.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the pre-planning side. So ideal scenario, companies thinking about making acquisition, they're really concerned about integration and culture and fit, and they call you early. They're just, putting it up on the drawing board. You come in. What exactly are you doing with that management team? How are you helping them think through, how to approach the acquisition from those perspectives, from integration and culture and all those types of things?
Sure. Yeah, certainly, we spend time obviously talking to them and looking at materials they have and how they've thought about the deal. But when we think about kind of the whole life cycle of an acquisition, and I'm kind of a bucket guy, so we think of it in three buckets. The first is, for shorthand, we call it day one, but it's really business continuity. So how do you want the business to operate post-close? And to what level do you want to integrate the business processes and that sort of thing? So we have a couple tools that we'll walk them through. And it's pretty simple stuff, but it's usually pretty instructive to get the leadership team together to make sure they're on the same page. But we'll go through different functional and process areas of the company and say, how deeply should we integrate this function or this business process? And it really prompts a very healthy discussion. It's just a little tool. You slide the arrow back and forth that say not much or a lot. And we can, test and challenge and talk about those things. And then similarly so that's kind of on the day one continuity. And we always believe, and I've been on the client side for a long time and did acquisitions in a variety of different ways. And if you screw that up, if you really don't have a good way to integrate the companies and preserve the top line, you can synergize until the cows come home and you might not have such a good deal. So we think that's really important to get that right. The second kind of bucket we think about are synergies and risks. So what are the handful of things where you see incremental value that the two companies are going to create? And then thinking about, and again, we have a similar sort of exercise to walk through that talk about different places where you may have an opportunity to achieve synergies. And again, get people on the same page, and then really make sure that over the course of the planning that you prioritize those things really well so that you don't try to do too much and that you can get things done quickly. And then the third is we think about soft goods. So that's all the human capital aspects of the deal. So that's pre and post close communications, organization structure, culture, things like that. And there we found, and I would say that's become much more interesting for people to talk about, and they're more interested in it than perhaps they used to be. I think CEOs used to think of that stuff as touchy-feely, and now I've come to realize how important that can be. And there we found a really good diagnostic tool that it's a third-party tool that we found works really well. And it gets underneath the culture in a way that's pretty insightful. Because oftentimes people say, our cultures are really the same. I walk around their plant and everybody says safety is important and productivity is important and quality and all those things. But this tool helps you really get underneath the covers a bit to understand more deeply how the companies actually work and make decisions and how they work as teams and how they value customers and that sort of thing. And it can be a really good way to complement all those qualitative aspects, which you're talking to people and maybe talking to a handful of customers to see what they think. So we typically try to work on those aspects fairly quickly to ensure that the leadership team on the acquiring side sort of has their act together and they're well aligned and they know what the important issues are. And it's good if you can do that even as diligence is starting, so that diligence can be really focused and you're really making sure you're paying attention to things that are really going to be critical to understand as you think about how to bring the two companies together.
Wow, sounds so fascinating to me, and I talk so often on the podcast and to my clients about how important the cultures and the people are in the transaction. My opinion is, products and services and what you do are great, but the people really make the thing tick, and making sure that you've got a good fit matters. So can we talk a little bit about that? So how does that process work? Are you interviewing employees? Are you interviewing clients? Are you behind the scenes and are you giving the tools to the management team to do this? Like, where are you in the process, and how deep does something like that go to test the cultures to make sure there's a fit here?
Sure. Yeah. Our philosophy as a firm in everything that we do is that we want the management team to be front and center. When I was on the other side of the table as a client, I never liked it when the consulting firms really kind of came in and took over and it became the XYZ project as opposed to my company's project. So we try to equip the leadership team as best we can and work closely with them. But what they've often found helpful, we'll typically interview the management team on our client side. And so, individually, and then we usually will try to facilitate some group discussions, with them. And then we'll be able to play back to them where we think there's alignment. Because oftentimes the deals are not, strategy and the issues are not as well communicated as you might think amongst the management team. So we'll do, the interviewing. And then as we get working, start to develop the integration teams, that kind of takes you to another level below that. And we're very hands-on the way that we like to work, and we try to engage. So we'll often talk to people and hear things and bring that forward. So some of it's highly structured. Other of it is not quite as structured. In some cases, we have a way where we can go out and talk to customers if we think this may be really impactful for them, and we'll get the opportunity to do a little bit of that and bring that in as well. And then the survey tool, which everybody doesn't always want to use, but when we've used it, it's an online survey. It's very effective. And so we'll kind of administer that, and then we help interpret the results. So we'll do all that work, as much as we need to behind the scenes and play the leadership where we need to. But we feel it's really critical for the leadership team and the people in the company to really own the process and understand it, and we'll help them execute as we need to. It varies, of course, by company and how many deals they've done, and how strong the team is with respect to working on an acquisition. So we'll try to be we'll plug in and do as much as we need to.
So Jeff, do you have a scenario or a situation or example where you did this work for a company and there was a gap, and maybe it was a significant gap or it was a small gap, and what occurred? I mean, did it result in a company walking away because it became obvious that the cultures just didn't mesh at all? Or, did you create this action plan that then they went and executed against?
Yeah. On this side of it, Domenic, there hasn't been a situation where a client has walked away from the deal because of something that they discovered. Sometimes that'll happen earlier where the management teams are talking when they just can't get along. But one of the things I really like about this tool is that it gives you the ability to diagnose where there may be issues and or opportunities to really leverage, and then put action plans against them. It's a really simple tool. It's easy to understand. I've used a few that are so esoteric you don't really understand what they mean. This one is very actionable. So it's usually in the part of the process where the deal is likely to occur, because you have to be careful how much you do with the target ahead of time, because we do it with both companies. So it really it helps provide an effective way to close some of the gaps that you see that may exist. But again, I go back to the strategy. We've had clients who have said, I'm buying this other company. I've known them for a long time. We're better than them. We like the way that we do things. So our goal is going to be to assimilate them into our culture without messing up anything that they do well. Others have said, we're a little bit different in the way that we operate, and we want to leverage the best of both worlds. So we're open to understanding a little bit better what they really do well and how they do it. And then we'll try to blend those two things together as effectively as we can over some reasonable period of time.
And you come back to them and you give them that some sort of report or a gap analysis or whatever it is. Do you have a name for it? Like what is that? What is that report?
It's really it's part of the diagnosis, it's a culture assessment and gap analysis.
Understood. So, look, this is, consulting. It looks like you've brought some science to this. And like you said, some third-party tools. How does somebody quantify what you're doing for them in this area? I mean, how do you, and, you could say, and I think very easily say that, the people are the most important thing, and you can't mess it up. And, what's the price of messing that up? But how do you as a firm, quantify the work that you're going to do for them there?
Yeah, broadly, I think you may have mentioned at the beginning, what we believe our mission with our clients is to help them really execute two things. One is an effective, seamless transition, which means no disruption to the core business. As I mentioned earlier, if you mess that up a bit, where you lose a customer, or for some reason you haven't checked the right boxes, you can't ship something, or there's some problem like that. So we talk about a seamless transition, which is the business operates well, and the organization model is in place, and the people that we want to retain are retained. We try to check, make sure we check those boxes off. And then the second, and we've had a pretty good track record of helping people exceed their synergy expectations, both in terms of typically the amount that they thought that they would achieve their plan. And then more importantly, I think, is we help them accelerate the time to benefit. So we try to really measure ourselves against those two things. And the people aspects of it really are a major component to both of those.
So, Jeff, along those lines, I've seen this time and time again. I think companies who don't do this a lot completely underestimate what it takes to do an integration and do it properly so that it is seamless and it doesn't take years to figure out, and you keep the people and they're motivated. So I'm curious, along those lines, when you deliver to a client the list of things that, they really need to pay attention to, what's the feedback you get there? Are they completely shocked at the comprehensive nature of what they have to look at? Did they anticipate those things? Like what's a typical reaction, and where's the gap, between what you need to accomplish and where their heads are at in regards to the integration?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it obviously varies a bit, but I think one of the things that we've been able to do over the years is we've developed, across all the things I've been talking about, a really good set of tools that help guide the process. So for example, regardless of when we're asked to show up, we have a series of functional planning tools. So if you think about, in most integrations, typically we'll line up the functional integration teams. And we've got this very comprehensive checklist that says, here are all the things you need to be thinking about in this area, things to be looking at and things to be planning for. But what we like to do is very quickly, based on information that we have and talking to the client very, very quickly, we can quickly customize those tools. So if there's 300 line items on the HR checklist, there might be 10 that really matter. And we can allow them to get very focused. So we're not whiteboarding stuff. We're not starting from scratch. But we're able to tailor these tools and all the things that we bring to the party very quickly to match up to the deal. So I think we were able to take things that might seem either abstract if they haven't done it, they're not sure where to start, or things that can be viewed as very complicated, and pretty quickly make them understandable, fairly straightforward. And then we have a couple of things we like to do early on. We call one a leadership workshop, where we'll typically do that. Some of the things I was describing earlier, we'll do that with the management team of the acquiring company. And then as early as we can, we'll get the leadership of the other company together in the same room. And we walk through, we have a fairly structured set of things that we walk through to get both sides well aligned. So now you think about, what are you going to go tell the troops, and how are they going to plan, and how are you going to communicate, what are you going to talk about? That it all becomes an output of that. And so now you've got kind of the guideposts for the planning exercise. And then right after that, we engage the integration teams, and we'll bring these tools. And I like to do, I'm an old school guy, so I like to do it in a room, with people around tables and flip charts and those sorts of things. And we'll guide them through completing their very first draft of those plans. So within a couple of days, you've got the strategic guidelines and all that guidance for the planning team. And then you've got the planning teams, each of which now has their draft plan that says, here are the most critical things I got to get done pre-close for day one and kind of through day 100. So now, and those are the things that we start marching, we start really executing on pre-close. So because it can be overwhelming. There's a million things to be thinking about, but there's the ones that are really going to be most critical for that deal. So we try to do that really quickly, because things are going to happen. Issues are going to pop up, and stuff that you thought was going to happen isn't. And having that tool and that sort of that approach allows you to adjust and adapt pretty quickly.
That's tremendous. Yeah. And it also, it sounds like your process and the way that Keystone approaches this is it gets buy-in as well from all of the parties that are going to be involved, that are going to be leading it, and the folks that are actually going to be executing it.
It's really, I think it's the most important thing. I always talk about, whether you call it the integration management office or whatever it is, there needs to be an integration leader who's going to do the right cadence and keep everything moving. And when we're involved, because we often will help lead that aspect, and then we'll have people sometimes that are deployed to help with different integration teams. And I always talk about that as a combat sport. And there's just no substitute for being very engaged with the people that you're working with. So we're not sitting in conference rooms and calling people, where's your status report? It's due today. But actually out helping them not only make sure that they're planning correctly, but oftentimes we'll help them resolve some of the issues that they have to resolve. So there's stuff that our clients need to do because they have the expertise and we may not, but there's often a handful of things. Like, for example, we can help review contracts. If there's a bunch of customer contracts and there's a certain set of clauses that we need to look for to identify where there might be some issues, we can take some of that burden off our clients, all of whom have a day job as well as a special projects. I just found it's one of the reasons I really like what we do and the way we do it. I think we really add a lot of value and help minimize the amount of time that the client needs to spend and make sure they're spending it as effectively and productively as possible.
And Jeff, am I correct in assuming that in these tools that you deliver with the integration plan, you're also identifying whether or not the companies have the right resources to actually implement, and if not, maybe identifying third parties that they might want to bring in to help them with certain aspects?
In fact, that's one of the very first outcomes when we start the planning exercises. We try to really keep focus. I think one of the things that companies often can do, because it can be overwhelming, they try to do too many things. So one thing is we based on our experiences, we'll help them really make sure they're getting very focused and prioritizing the things that are going to be really critical. And then part of one of the outcomes of those very initial sessions is, okay, if I'm going to do this post-close, what's that going to take? And so we develop a pretty high level, plan early in the pre-close period for what I'm going to need to achieve those results post-close. So sometimes it's a third party. Oftentimes, given the experiences and the expertise of our people, we'll complement their team. So, for example, we had a deal last year we worked on that was really, really fun deal. And their biggest post-close initiative was a public deal. And they had given a synergy number out to the investment community. And the biggest part of that was on procurement. So there were two very similar companies. So they had a good procurement team, but it was small. And they had never really done an exercise like this before. So we were able to support them in a few different really critical ways. One is we helped them think through for each of their categories of spend, what's the right approach to go out to the market? So do you do a full RFQ? Do you simply go to the lowest price guy? And so that, there's some nuances to that and some knowledge that helps you decide that. And then once you decide those, you prioritize them based on time to benefit and value. And then also we have a kind of a process that we've done several times and some tools that help them go effectively out to the market and interact with the suppliers and do the negotiation. So they're doing the bulk of that work typically, and we're supporting them and you kind of holding their hand to some degree through that process and making sure it gets done effectively and quickly. So I think, again, I believe time to benefit is really important, and most companies just don't have enough people sitting around waiting to do this kind of stuff. So whether it's us or
everybody's got a full-time job, right? And now they've got integration thrown on top of that, and it could be completely overwhelming, right? And there goes all your plans down the tubes. So I totally get this. It makes total sense to me. And it's so important to have the plan in place and be thinking about integration, have the right resources. Jeff, give me an example, if you have one, where someone didn't do the proper planning and now the Keystone Group is having to come in and do triage. What does that look like? What are you doing? What's your approach in those situations?
Sure. Oftentimes it's private equity roll-ups that don't work so well, and those can turn sour fairly quickly. I would say on the corporate side of it, it's if you think about some of the things I believe are sort of best practice kind of things about clarity and speed and all that, where they haven't done that well. So we had a situation a couple of years ago where what they had failed to do was to really understand the importance of of kind of their post-close go-to-market strategy. And I find companies oftentimes are reluctant to, I'll say, mess around too much on the commercial side of it because they think that if they just leave everything alone, it's going to be just fine. And in this particular case, there were some, if you think about these deals, that when the deals get announced, the customer is expecting something. They typically expect, like people do, they expect something's going to change. There should be some communication. And so what happened was they basically in several instances had people from both companies continuing to serve the same customers, but without any clarity about what they were doing and why. So the interface that they were presenting to the customer for everything from the person calling on them to how they went about the order to cash process, how they even sent out an order acknowledgement or sent out an invoice. And the customer said, you're becoming more difficult to do business with after post-acquisition than it was before when I was dealing with you separately. So we've helped with this a few times. We have a concept, we just call it one face to the customer. So we help them pretty quickly go through from the time a phone call comes in to the time you end up delivering and then collecting cash from your customer. How do we revamp all of that to make it more streamlined? And we called it one face to the customer. How do you present a unified face? And they were able to go out and talk to the customers and kind of say, hey, look, we realized we should have done this. We didn't, and give us a little bit of time. We've got a plan, and we're gonna solve it. So there was some disruption that they had by not having done that, but we were able to help them implement that fairly quickly. It wasn't elegant behind the scenes, but to the customers, they were able to kind of course correct, reasonably quickly and mitigate some of the potential damage that might have done.
And when you say reasonably quickly, are we talking months, weeks? How long?
We were able to help them communicate the plan pretty quickly. And then it was about 80% of the customer base. So I think that one was probably a couple of months from start to finish, because there were some obviously things operationally that needed to occur to make sure that it worked properly. But again, we collectively with the client, we're able to communicate upfront, hey, here's what we're going to do. Here's what we're shooting for. And actually we're able to get some customer input too, which was helpful. So we bought some time. So I think it was a couple of months, if I recall correctly, something like that.
Jeff, the work that you guys do at the Keystone Group, I think is outstanding. It's so necessary. Let's, sort of wrap up here. And you've had a bird's eye view. You're an expert in this field. You've been involved in many M&A integrations. If you were to leave the M&A Unplugged community with a couple of thoughts about transactions, acquisitions, integration, culture, what would those be? What are your big messages to folks out there?
Sure. I'd say a couple things. I've mentioned speed a couple of times, and I don't mean to be reckless, but I think, you only have so much time post-close to do things, and people are expecting you to do things. So think about what are the handful of things that are going to be really important, and how do I try to execute on those, crisply and relatively quickly. So I keep momentum and those sorts of things. And to do that, I think also kind of mentioned, I think clarity and focus at the beginning, and then alignment around what those really important things are and get people lined up to do those well. Second, I would say is, and we haven't talked a whole lot about communications, but I think we always suggest to people that the earlier you can start communicating both to your own company and then as appropriate to the target about what you plan to do, and then be consistent, it's really critical. And there, I think, I always talk about being very candid, because sometimes there are things that you're going to do that you plan to do that you think the target's not going to like, because maybe you're going to consolidate 2 plants or close an office or something like that. In my experience, both having been in companies that were acquired as well as what I've seen on this side of it, is that people, if you treat people like adults, they're going to behave accordingly. And so we've had situations where, something like that was going to occur, and at the appropriate time, we communicated that. And I can't tell you how many times people said, I really appreciate you telling me that. And we had a plan for, okay, this is going to happen. It's going to happen over 3 months. Here's what your role can be. You may or may not have an opportunity to be part of the company. And usually those people are the ones who really will be engaged effectively. So I think that's important, the communication. And then I think, post-close, in addition to doing those initiatives quickly, I think senior level engagement from both sides, but mainly from the acquiring company. So they'll often be very involved at close, and they'll go out and visit people and shake hands and all that sort of thing. And the best way, I think, for culture to be embodied and embraced is for people from both companies, for them to be seen working together. And I think if the leadership team does that effectively, it can overcome a lot of sins. And an effective, engaged sort of leader and leadership team, I think, can be really, really critical. And I can't emphasize enough the importance of that, both pre and post close.
Jeff, those are outstanding points. Those are great. It's been such a pleasure having you on. I think we could go on, and we may even want to revisit this at a later date, because there are things here that we didn't unpack that I think we could really go down and get even deeper. But if folks wanted to reach you at the Keystone Group, how could they get in touch with you?
My email address is J Alvis, ALV like Victor, IS like Sam, at the Keystone Group, all one word, .com. And probably easiest other way, my cell phone number is 708-205-6759.
Jeff, thank you again. It's been such a pleasure to have you on. M&A Unplugged community, just to summarize a few of the key things that came up today that Jeff pointed out. The time to think about integration is the day that you start to think about doing an acquisition. There are so many elements that are going to come into this, like, do you have the people and the resources to actually execute integration after you acquire a firm? Do you have the expertise? Understanding that integration needs to be done seamlessly, as quickly as possible, so that you don't lose momentum on either side. These are such key points. And then communication, both internal and external, having a key plan on how you're going to communicate to people and do it, as quickly as possible and as frequently as you can. Okay, folks, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. All of the information will be available in the show notes. If you would like to learn more about the process of acquiring or selling a business, please visit our website at sunacquisitions.com, or feel free to reach out to me at drinaldi@sunacquisitions.com. I look forward to seeing you again on the next episode of the M&A Unplugged podcast. And until then, please remember that scaling, acquiring, or selling a business takes time, preparation, and the proper knowledge.
Thank you for joining us today on M&A Unplugged. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and recommend it wherever you get your podcasts. If you want more great information on how to scale, acquire, or sell a business, please visit our website at sunacquisitions.com.